Let's return now to the investigation into the missing Malaysian airliner. Today we've seen anguish from some of the families of those on board and anger too directed at the authorities in Kuala Lumpur. Well, we're joined via Skype from Houston in Texas by Robert Jensen, a leading crisis management expert and chief executive of Kenyan International Emergency Services. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Jensen. First of all, clearly there's been a very difficult dynamic for the Malaysian authorities in terms of territory, in terms of organisation, in terms of debris not being found. But is there any glaring error, one single error that stood out to you so far in how they've conducted this?
Well, I don't think there's been any secret about my previous comments. I think the biggest thing that's sad here, obviously there's the loss, but sad for going forward is there's no credibility. And that is something that's so desperately needed so that when families are given information, they can believe it, they can trust it. But without credibility, it's very hard to actually take all the information that's coming out and figure out what's fact and what's fiction.
Has there been a problem with the way they've laid out the logistics of talking to the press and talking to the families? It seems that those two are very separate issues, and yet they've crossed paths, and it's been quite disturbing to watch.
Yeah, well, I think here, going forward, and to me, what I think people should focus on, what the airline should focus on, is how do we take care of families from this point forward? If we can't undo what's been done. So how you set up is you set up a family assistance center. You have a conference bridge. You have a mechanism to get your care team members, your specialty assistance team members, out to those families who don't travel. You give them information first. You give them factual information. You can't keep double-stepping or coming back to it. And you start to lay the groundwork to help the families transition from where they're at today, where they were at when they learned about their loved ones being aboard the missing flight, to how they're going to transition. And you do that by giving them information and starting to talk to them. Giving up hope is a hard thing.
What about the geography, Robert, between Beijing and Kuala Lumpur? Families in Beijing, families in Kuala Lumpur. Do you need to coordinate better how you deal with those two different cities?
Absolutely. But what you do, you bring all families to one location. And those families that can't travel to the location, you set up telecommunications so that when you're briefing one group, the whole group hears the same briefing at the same time. That's why you use a conference bridge. You use the technology that exists to bring those families to the same place, if not physically, to the same place for communication. And what you do is you start to tell them what you know, not what you think, not what you speculate, but what you know. And then you have to know each of the families as individuals. You start to build a profile, a picture. You build a picture of the person who's missing. You build a picture of the family so you can work with the families and start to say, we are now concerned because of the time. We don't feel that this aircraft is going to be found with survivors. They shouldn't hear that en masse on a text or from the media. They should hear that during private or the family briefs.
What if you just don't know enough? I mean, we know now that the impression we get is the Malaysians felt they had to say something. They felt they had to answer questions when really they weren't sure of their ground. How do you survive 2 weeks of knowing pretty much nothing, but you're having questions fired at you the whole time?
Yeah, it's not easy, and I understand. Been there many times. There are 3 words that a CEO says to a family just to begin with that have the most important impact. I'm sorry. Those are the 3 most important words you start with. The next words are 4. I do not know. And you don't make up when you don't know. You tell what you do know. You give technical briefings on the aircraft. What are the possibilities? What are the equipment? What are the things that are being done to identify the potential location? And then you start helping the families transition. There's payments to help them through this time. But if they're not going to take them because there's no trust, then you're not going to be able to even help the families bridge the next 2 weeks, the next month. We don't know when or if the aircraft will be found. So what needs to happen is that information direct to families and a pattern that says, here's where you are and here's where we think you're going to have to go.
What about the issue of the debris, of a crash site, of eventual discovery or not of the aircraft? Say the aircraft is finally discovered. There's so many countries involved now in terms of the search, in terms of offering intelligence, what they know, what they've seen on their own communication systems. How do you coordinate all that?
Well, again, you send liaisons to governments. You set up a central coordination area. In the United States, we call that a Joint Family Support Operations Center. And everyone agrees that communication goes through that center. And you coordinate so when information comes out, it's released simultaneously. It's released to the families first, and then it's released simultaneously through the other media or to the media outlets. And you use the right words so that, again, we don't say something's a fact that's not a fact. We don't say, oh, we know debris is here. We explain to families that the ocean carries a lot of debris, sadly. And that until a ship can actually recover something, it's just debris. We don't keep building up expectations and hope. Because every time we do that when we're wrong, it makes it that much harder for the families. They're waiting and hanging on every word. This isn't about a missing aircraft. It's about how do you take care of several hundred family members and transition them from what was the life they had to what's going to be a very difficult period for, I imagine, the next several months and possibly years, sadly.
Robert Jensen, thanks very much indeed for joining us there from Houston with your thoughts.
You're welcome.
Well, as we were saying, 26 countries now involved in the search for the missing Malaysian airline. A crucial task now, of course, is, if they find some debris that's meaningful, to retrieve the plane's black box data recorder. That could explain